Let's talk a little bit about the great contrast, which is still in living memory, for many people at least, of Malcolm X and Martin Luther King, since these were contemporaries and competitors in a way, particularly in the early days. Now, in the same speech, his best speech, Ballad or the Bullet, Malcolm X said the following, quote, "It'll be Molotov cocktails this month, hand grenades next month, and something else next month. It'll be ballots or it'll be bullets. It'll be liberty or it will be death. The only difference about this kind of death, as compared to Martin Luther King's nonviolent strategy, was it'll be reciprocal." And on those incendiary words, despite those incendiary words, you say in your review that theoretically Malcolm X was on firmer ground than King. He stood with the American Declaration of Independence and John Locke and the American revolutionaries. Now, explain yourself.
Yeah,
How could that be?
Let's just go back to the Declaration, right? Americans, or all people, have rights. Those are natural rights. If a government is set up to protect those rights. If government fails to do that, you have a right of revolution. You can violently replace that government. So Malcolm X says the question is, are our rights being violated in such a way that it warrants resort to the right of revolution? Now, Malcolm X himself, he doesn't actually do that, right? He never picks up a gun himself, but he makes Americans aware that that's really the question. Are you going to give us the ballot, as is our due, or do we have to resort to revolution? And he says there's really no intermediate space between those things. And I actually think he's right about that. Now, my assessment of the situation is different than his. So instead of being, in line with Malcolm X, I'm actually much more conservative than Malcolm X.
But do you conflate violent resistance, which is in fact what he's calling for, with the right of revolution? If you think of Abraham Lincoln or Jefferson or people and even Locke who talk about this, they smuggle in, at some point in the analysis, in addition to a right to rebel if your rights are being violated, some consideration of the practicability of success.
Sure.
And you're not permitted to do it if it's fruitless, or if you would usher in something worse than what you're trying to get rid of.
And so it's probably true that Malcolm X is not a very prudent man. On the other hand, that speech, the Ballad or the Bullet, there is, it's a really very sophisticated speech. And as I say, he doesn't just come out, in a way, he doesn't quite come out in favor of revolution. He's saying, we are going to threaten revolution in order to make you make good on the 15th Amendment, on the promise of the ballot. And so I think, the way Locke argues that when people become aware that they have this right of revolution, that is really the best check to make and keep government good.
Right. But I guess one question is, does he ever mention the word revolution?
Oh, sure, yeah.
So he's not calling just for a kind of secession, where we're going to defend our neighborhoods and we're going to resist any violence against our people.
Well, again, he plays it a little, often when he speaks about actual violence, it is always put in terms of self-defense. And so when he talks about the rifle clubs and things like that, it's very much in terms of self-defense.
Yes, you're right. The speech is more subtle than those parts of it I've just read would indicate. There are a lot of qualifiers in it, but still, does your defense of him, to the extent what you're offering is a defense of him, presuppose that this was primarily designed to scare Americans into supporting civil rights and voting rights legislation in the 60s?
Yeah, I think so.
So he's not exactly, he's threatening something.
He's threatening.
But he's not.
He's threatening the bullet to secure the ballot.
Yes.
And that...
But still only in self-defense.
Yeah,
Yeah.
and that he is not on board with the integrationist direction of, say, King's movement. Doesn't think that's really the issue.
Right.
The issue is certain rights.
Now, why do you think Malcolm X is sounder than Martin Luther King on the question of civil disobedience?
Yeah, I think because King tries to find some halfway position between obedience and revolution. So it seems to me that...
explain that a little bit more. What's halfway about it?
That you think there is a way to be disobedient civilly.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
That you can come up with a strategy that is not one of the legal strategies for changing bad laws,
mm-hmm.
right? I mean, there are all kinds of ways in which Americans can change the law. They have petition and
Sure.
various forms of legal protest, using persuasion to
Going to
change
court,
the views, of
yeah.
your fellow Americans. So it's an exercise in persuasion. And in fact, if you acknowledge the equal rights of others, it is really obligatory upon you
mm-hmm.
to operate through persuasion. And it seems to me that there are times in which King crosses that line and he resorts to disobedience.
Mm-hmm.
And he believes that disobedience can be civil because he says it's done, out of love for the nation, yes. and love for the law, and because you do it openly and lovingly, and you're going to take the penalty upon yourself.
Do you distinguish civil disobedience in his sense from the kind of from the disobedience of a law that results in a court challenge?
Yes. In other words, because of judicial review, there is already within the American system a rather large opening mm-hmm. in the direction of civil disobedience, a sort of constitutionalized form of that.
You have to break the law
for it to
be tested.
But remember,
yeah.
Rosa Parks in fact broke no law because mm-hmm. the court said that state statute was in fact in violation of the Constitution, mm-hmm. so it was not a valid law. But that does not require massive acts of
civil disobedience. It doesn't require continued marches and protests
right.
and so forth.
And many, I really want to sort of try to draw some fine lines here. Many of those mass actions were perfectly legitimate and perfectly within the law. Mm-hmm. There are only certain times in which King veers into law breaking.
Right.
And it's that I really fault him for. And I think it set a very bad precedent for our understanding of citizenship, for our understanding of what the responsibilities of Republican citizens are.
So this is, I think, an interesting argument. You don't hear Martin Luther King criticized very often on his cardinal principle of nonviolent civil disobedience.
Yeah.
So would you say the deepest level of your criticism is that when pursued as a strategy of deliberately breaking the law in nonviolent ways, mm-hmm. that you're still choosing which laws you will obey and which laws you won't obey?
There are all of these forms of nullification out there. I mean, the South, in the Civil War engages in its own form of nullification and secession. The Garrisonians, on the basis of the individual conscience, engaged in another kind of nullification. Mm-hmm. And I think King is, in a way, slipping into that with his defense of civil disobedience.
But isn't Malcolm X also taking kind of middle position, I mean, between actual revolution, which he's not making, and law-abidingness?
Well, in a way you could say Malcolm X
to get the ballot
remains at the level of talk.
Uh-huh.
Right? Which might be a criticism of him, or it might be to say he really was using a kind of verbal persuasion, mm-hmm. which is quite different from what King does in just bollocksing up the works as much as he can.
Right.
In line with Thoreau's principle, be the person that sort of stops the machine.
Yeah.
And in doing that, I think there is a failure to understand what Jefferson said in his first inaugural, that the will of the majority is in all cases to prevail. Mm-hmm. While we remember that that will to be rightful
the next
must
line,
be reasonable, that the minority possess their equal rights, which equal laws must respect.
Okay.
But that the way you correct those errors in the law is through democratic persuasion and through constitutional means.